President Trump knows about Islam's warlike, bloody history. So does Tommy Robinson. So do I. So does my dad. So why did the far left refuse to acknowledge the truce, slavery, the genocide, which Islam has done for 1400 years? This is famous King Richard Lionheart, fighter for Christendom.
Anticipate the storm that would be unleashed when Richard of England heard the holy city was back in Muslim hands.
Allahu Akbar.
The loss of Jerusalem was a disaster for Richard and the Christians in Europe. The Pope immediately issued a decree. Jerusalem was to be recaptured at all costs. In Christianity's darkest hour, Richard prepared to take on Saladin.
Richard would have heard the name Saladin many, many times. He would have known of Saladin's huge success as the leader of the Muslim world. The opportunity to match himself against someone so famous was an opportunity not to be missed. As soon as he heard the news that Saladin had taken Jerusalem, he at once, without a moment's thought, impetuously, knowing instinctively it was the right thing to do, took the cross.
Richard received a fabric cross that all crusaders pledged to wear until Jerusalem was back in Christian hands.
Richard would know that if he could lead a crusade that recaptured Jerusalem, he would go down in the annals of history as one of the greatest heroes of Christendom. This was his time.
When Richard, the greatest knight in Europe, became a crusader, thousands followed his example. Men prepared to leave their families. The crosses sewn onto their tunics, signifying that they were now a part of Christ's army, led by Richard. Men who had never left their villages would travel 2,000 miles to join him in the fight for Jerusalem. In return, the church would forgive them all their sins, a reward for which many were ready to die.
Crusaders embarking for the Holy Land must have felt an enormous mix of emotions. They were leaving their wives, their families. They themselves were going into the unknown. They were going into lands that they hadn't seen or experienced before. They knew from previous crusades you probably had a 1 in 3 chance of dying or not coming back. So great fear, and also a sense of moral right. They felt crusading was a good purpose.
In the summer of 1190, Richard, now King of England, set sail for the Holy Land. Richard had spent a fortune on provisions. It was said he would have been prepared to sell London to aid Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, Saladin realized instead of stopping the Holy War, his actions had inflamed it. Saladin's council was becoming increasingly concerned. They knew that Richard's army was sailing to join Franks, released from Jerusalem, who had regrouped 100 miles north and were now besieging the Muslim port of Acre. Acre was the key port in the eastern Mediterranean. If the Christians could seize it, they would secure a bridgehead into the Holy Land. But if Saladin could break the siege, he could force the invaders back into the sea. When Saladin arrived at Acre, he ordered his army to surround the Christian besiegers. But the Crusaders were too deeply entrenched for him to win another dramatic victory. The siege was a stalemate. Now Saladin decided to starve the Christians into submission. In the Crusader camp around Acre, food was so scarce, mounted knights were forced to eat grass. They had already eaten their horses. Hunger, malnutrition, and disease killed thousands and made some desperate men desert the crusade. A few even converted to Islam and went over to Saladin. The Crusaders' tenuous hold on Acre was slipping away. After months at sea, in May 1191, Richard, King of England, sighted the Holy Land for the first time.
It was the crucial point in a great world struggle between two great religions. As Richard sails to it, we get a description of him looking at the tents, seeing where Saladin's lines are, assessing the strength of the walls, already the soldier, planning what he will do next. He approached Acre not as a pilgrim, but as a commander.
Richard's arrival brought a new sense of hope to the desperate men at Acre. The starving Crusaders lit fires in honor of their new leader. In the Muslim camp above Acre, Saladin sensed that in Richard he would face a difficult opponent. The King of England's reputation as a formidable warrior preceded him. But at the city walls, the Crusader catapults were quiet. Richard was ill with the deadly camp fever and incapable of fighting. He was confined to his sickbed, but Richard knew there were other ways of winning a war.
One of the first things he did was to send a message to Saladin saying, can we have a summit meeting? Let's you and I meet face to face and sort this out. Now, no crusading commander had ever done anything like this before. It was unprecedented.
Richard sought to establish a personal relationship with Saladin to try and win the war with diplomacy.
The idea that they were not just your great enemy whom you fought and hoped to send to hell, but someone you could talk to. Partly it's Richard's belief that he could persuade people. If only he could meet them and talk to them, then he could get through to them. They could bring an end to the whole business of the crusade on terms that suited Richard by talking to Saladin himself.
But Saladin would not be so easily seduced. Believing he had the advantage, and considering it dishonorable to meet someone he intended to kill, Saladin politely declined to meet Richard.
I think Richard was taken aback when Saladin refused to meet him. He thought he was a persuasive character, but this didn't apparently cut ice with Saladin, in the sense that he, first of all, didn't trust Richard. He thought he would never keep his word. Second, he thought there was no possibility of reaching a peace treaty with Richard.
Early attempts at diplomacy failed, but Saladin decided to show Richard that he followed the chivalric code as well as any Christian knight. He sent the ailing King of England a gift. Saladin was proud of his reputation as a generous man. He had already given away thousands of horses to his troops at Acre. To Richard, he sent fruit for his illness. It seemed as if Saladin was impatient for Richard to recover. Soon, Richard was well again, and he descended on Acre. In Richard, the Muslim defenders faced a new kind of leader who fought from the front, risking his life alongside his troops. He seemed unstoppable.
The Muslim defenders were facing the crunch. The arrival of Richard meant that the pressure exerted by the Christians was now almost unbearable. They were very, very short of food, and Saladin didn't seem to be able to offer them relief.
From his hilltop camp, Saladin could do little to help. But he refused to let the Muslims in Acre surrender. Richard's onslaught continued. The Muslims resisted for almost a week, and still no relief came from Saladin. It seemed like the people of Acre were being left to die. Eventually, without Saladin's permission, they gave up the fight.
In the end, they forced his hand. They forced him to surrender the city. And this wasn't to his liking, but at the same time, everybody was exhausted.